Today we're going to look at the reasons and the numbers behind why wolf management kills so many wolves per year. Is there really any biological justification for killing these animals? And how many wolves does Montana actually have? You'll be surprised at the answers. Hi, welcome back. And today we're going to review the history of wolf management in Montana over the past 20 years and into the present. And this includes my review of their wolf population data and the methods of how Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks determined and currently determines the size of the wolf population each year. And remember that Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is the state agency responsible for the management of wolves and many other species. They currently use a different method to determine wolf numbers than they used to in the past years, but it still incorporates the same pitfalls and thinking that they've always employed. Therefore, it's important to look at how they used to do things and compare it with what they do now. And it illustrates that although the methods have changed, the mentality is not. Currently, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks claims that Montana has maintained an estimated average wolf population since 2011 of 1,165 wolves, which corresponds to an average of 195 packs. And these numbers are from the current 2023 wolf management plan provided by the state of Montana. In the past, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks literally tried to count how many wolves are on the landscape, with the help of public observations, hunter reports, and a few radio-collared wolves. For example, this map from 2017 shows 124 verified packs of 2 or more wolves. This apparently represented a minimum of 633 wolves, and it was a minimum count that Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks obtained each year. And it's a minimum count because they just assume they missed the presence of some wolves. These days, a modeling system called Integrated Patch Occupancy Model, or IPOM, is used to predict how many wolves there are rather than count them. There have been apparently enough wolves over the past decade or so that makes counting them impractical. Now, using mostly hunter information, IPOM predicts the numbers of wolves and where they are. So let's go over the accuracy of how Fish, Wildlife, and Parks counted wolves in the past and see if it's any more accurate using the IPOM method. In the past, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks website provided a description of their wolf program, which is an example here. And they do something similar now, but the wording is a bit different, and we'll get to that later. Nevertheless, the focus has always been on maintaining a wolf population large enough so that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does not put the wolves back on the endangered species list and remove management control from the state. And remember that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is the federal agency that carried out wolf recovery and built up a wolf population in the western states, meaning Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, before turning over management of these animals to those states. You'll also notice that according to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, wolves needed to be managed because of their impacts on game populations and livestock. Although, in the past, the Endangered Species Act protected these animals, currently it protects them in a minimal way, and it requires the states to maintain 150 wolves, which includes 15 breeding pairs. And it's optional if the states want to kill the rest of the wolves. And although the western states don't have to kill wolves, they've all opted to do so because annual hunting and hunting seasons provide revenue for state management agencies like Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, along with perpetuating the hatred and bigotry the local culture shows towards these animals, thereby always having a steady supply of people wanting to kill wolves, which then completes the loop back to creating revenue. But, again, if the states fall below these minimum numbers of 150 wolves and 15 breeding pairs, they're going to be placed back onto the endangered species list. So the states are trying very hard for that not to happen while still killing the rest of the wolves. In the meantime, do the wolf numbers, do they really need controlling, meaning wolves, to manage impacts on game population or livestock? And I'm talking about currently and in the past. In other words, it's still justified to kill these animals. So let's take a look at that, because I reviewed this information to see if that made any sense. In 2011, I published a review of Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks wolf population data and their claims that wolves needed to be managed because of their impacts on domesticated livestock and prey populations. And for many years, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks claimed that the entire process of wolf recovery in the state, which included the annual hunting of wolves, was based in science. They even posted these statements on their website at the time. For example, an annual, regulated, well-planned, and science-based hunt. And to this day, they still make these claims, but they are worded a bit differently. These claims being that public harvesting of wolves is based in science and is needed because of the increased conflict with livestock and concern about the status of some deer and elk populations where the wolves are present. So let's take a look at what my review found, piece by piece, from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks claims, meaning about the livestock depredation, and to how the wolf population was counted to begin with. So we're going to take a look at all of this, and we'll compare that with what is happening now. This table summarizes the number of livestock killed by wolves each year through 2010, which was the time frame in which I reviewed their wolf population data. And here are some examples of years after that, just for comparison. And you can see the agency kept track of the number of cattle killed, sheep, domestic dogs, and so on. In fact, here's the current graph that shows the overall pattern and the numbers of depredations. And depredations, if you don't already know, means livestock killing by predators. And this is the entire history of it up until the present. As the graph indicates, the greatest number of depredations occurred in 2009. So we'll focus on this year as our example, because wolves were apparently at their peak when it came to killing livestock. You'll see now, however, if that justifies hunting them or not. So let's go back for the table for details. In 2009, 97 cattle were lost to wolves. But how many cattle overall were there in the state? Well, I spent hours looking through the public records of livestock populations in every county of Montana to obtain a more accurate account or an accurate count of the total number of cattle, rather than just believing what people might claim on their own. The total I arrived at was 2.6 million cattle, which included calves, and that meant wolves apparently killed 0.004% of the cattle in Montana during 2009. However, it's not like these animals, including the wolves, were evenly distributed across the landscape. Most cattle were on the east side of the state, meaning east of the Rocky Mountains, and most of the wolves were in the western part of the state, so west of the Rocky Mountains. Therefore, I found a total of how many cattle were just in the western part of the state, which was 494,100, so almost 500,000 cattle. And of those 500,000 cattle, 97 were killed by wolves, which amounted to 0.02%. Also in 2009, wolves killed some sheep. There were 33,000 sheep at the time, including lambs, in western Montana. And we'll stick to the west side of the state because that's where all the wolves were. And in 2009, they killed 202 sheep. It's usually never this many, but one pack went on a killing frenzy and killed half the number of those sheep. Although rare, wolves are known to produce this behavior, and it's called surplus killing. But we're still not sure what the trigger is that causes this to occur. Presumably because the prey, sheep in this case, are highly vulnerable and easy to obtain, and wolves, like other predators, are designed to kill prey and always looking for that opportunity, because it doesn't happen very often, even in the best of times. Suddenly they're presented with a very unusual situation and are only taking advantage of it. And science now knows that when this scenario does occur, wolves return to the kill site later to consume what they have killed. But as you can see in the table, this is the only time this situation occurred and is very rare. The point is that despite this event, only 0.6% of sheep in Montana were killed by wolves. Therefore, Overall, which includes cattle and sheep, wolves were responsible for less than 0.1% of total livestock loss in 2009. Even if wolves killed 1,000 cattle, this would only be 0.2% of the western Montana cattle population. In other words, statistically, the wolf depredation problem barely exists. Socially and economically, however, there is nothing statistical about suffering a real financial loss, sometimes thousands of dollars, often accompanied by a range of emotions. And the statistics do not show how many animals the ranchers had to begin with. For example, it's a different scenario when losing 9 out of 1,000 animals than losing 9 out of 10 animals. Now that we've covered the concern of wolves depredating on livestock, let's take a look at the potential threat wolves might have on prey populations and see if this justifies killing them. First, here is some background. At present, wolves in Montana are classified as a species in need of management, as stated in the current wolf management plan. This classification allows wolf managers more latitude in dealing with potential issues in regards to depredations and for balancing the wolves' effects on prey species versus human hunting of those same species. In other words, wolves can't be allowed to kill so many prey individuals that humans don't have the chance to kill them instead. And as part of this management process, wolves are killed, which helps to ensure that there are enough prey for people to hunt. That's the idea, anyway. All of this brings in revenue to the state and Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. But as stated in this example, the wolf population cannot get below 150 individuals. That includes 15 breeding pairs. And as mentioned before, that means the federal government can take full control of wolf management, which is what the states are trying to prevent. In the meantime, however, the states can do whatever they want with the remainder of the wolves. Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks also states in the current management plan that wolves are managed with consideration to ever-changing ecological and socio-political circumstances. However, many of these circumstances constantly conflict, such as cattle grazing on natural landscape and the impacts it has on the surrounding environment. For example, wolves killing the livestock, which then sets in motion the hatred of wolves, or the belief that too many wolves threaten the populations of prey species. In other words, when viewing the natural environment as a giant resource placed here just for us, it causes a mess. Wolf management is only one example of many management practices occurring simultaneously. The net result has been the severe degradation of our ecosystems, both on land and in the water. But in our neck of the woods, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is trying to balance all of this and trying to keep everyone happy at the same time. This, of course, is impossible. Yet, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks also stated in the current wolf management plan that understanding how predator and prey populations respond to management will always have some degree of uncertainty. And they also acknowledged that population size of the wolves' prey, such as deer and elk, is intensely debated and are managed based on competing human desires. The point of all this is that Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks acknowledges the complexities of wildlife management, but it also shows that little attention is given to maintaining a healthy ecosystem because of what human beings want, rather than understanding of how natural processes actually work. In addition, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks states that broader habitat management and conservation purposes are also served by the presence of large carnivores. Science already knows this to be true, which we'll go over in a future video, and yet Fish, Wildlife, and Parks still hunts and kills wolves as the main component to wolf management. Apparently, wolf managers, instead of the natural forces, decide on the amount of influence wolves will have on the surrounding environment, even though they already stated that there will always be some uncertainty given the complex interactions that occur in the environment. In other words, does anyone here actually know what they're doing? But regardless, they go on to say, providing and sustaining an adequate prey base for wolves requires that ungulates and their habitats be carefully managed, which ultimately benefits entire plant and animal communities. So, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks actually believes that they can control the natural forces that keep ecosystems intact, apparently. But regardless, whether they can manage properly or not, by default, any chance of getting it right depends on knowing how many wolves, deer, elk, moose, and so on are out there. What then are the population levels of these species, and how are they counted? Let's start by trying to answer the question, can wolves be a threat to prey populations? At least from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks' perspective. Again, you would have to know how many individual wolves and prey items there are in the surrounding environment. If you don't know that first, then you can't know if wolves are a threat or not. Maybe they are, but there's no way to know. We'll work our way through the prey population numbers, then see how wolves are counted as well. First up is white-tailed deer, which are known to be plentiful in western Montana. On their website, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks states that Montana has a long history of research to provide basic information about deer and their habitats, and to develop and test new and improved methods and criteria for deer management. That sounds good, but the current deer population report shows some ambiguity to their claims. This is the table from the current 2023 white-tailed deer population, and it's a report that can be found on Fish, Wildlife, and Parks' website. It lists the deer population in each of the 7 management regions in the state from 2014 to 2023. You don't need to focus on all these numbers unless you find them interesting, because the important thing here involves the bulleted statements below the table. It's sort of like Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks saying, here are the population numbers we have for white-tailed deer, but, and those caveats are listed out at the bottom here. First, they state that the estimates for white-tailed deer populations are based upon population modeling with survey and harvest inputs. In other words, these numbers are based on analysis of some actual surveys, but keep in mind as to how they were done, and the number of reported deer killed by hunters. So the population numbers are guesstimates of whatever the modeling system comes up with. As if to point out that these numbers really are guesstimates, they go on to state that white-tailed deer estimates are not comprehensively validated with site-specific research or enhanced monitoring efforts. This simply means that for the most part, no one was actually standing there counting the deer. Therefore, their data is incomplete, and the general emphasis of figuring out the deer population is based more on statistical guessing rather than actual data collected in the field. And their third and last statement points this out. And they say white-tailed deer estimates are not framed with confidence intervals and are subject to adjustment. This means their guesstimated numbers aren't really scientifically valid. A confidence interval is a basic statistical parameter that gives an idea of how accurate your data is. For example, a confidence interval of 95% means that 95% of the time the data collected will fall within a normally distributed range or curve. The other 5% represents the exceptions that don't fit this curve. In other words, the data collected should constantly fit within an acceptable range, which has an upper and lower limit where the data is considered accurate. If the data being collected shows numbers that are wildly all over the place, then perhaps the data isn't being measured properly and adjustments can be made. Therefore, confidence intervals is a method that scientists use to see if their data sucks or not, at least at the time of collecting it. In a narrower range, such as a 99% confidence interval, the more accurate the data is considered to be. The white-tailed deer data, however, has no confidence intervals at all. The numbers are not accurate, at least enough to know what impact wolves have on the white-tailed deer population, at least for management purposes. Instead, the numbers are guesstimates from a modeling system. In fact, most of what Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks does with their numbers involves modeling systems. So a quick word about modeling systems is necessary. And I'm just explaining here the background of how numbers are used in science so that we can go through the remaining numbers of other prey items and the wolves themselves much more efficiently and with a better understanding of what is really going on when Fish, Wildlife, and Parks collects data. Modeling, then, is a technique used by scientists to take raw data and attempt to construct a mathematical or graphical representation of what that data means. So modeling is just a way to start looking at something that's so complex, you don't really know where to start, like weather systems or the ecosystem and so on. Therefore, all models are simplified reflections of reality. But models provide a more straightforward understanding of the topic being studied, but this is only a beginning. The results that models produce are dependent on the quality of data that they are fed. Therefore, models can often be devoid of the real complexities of the situation and can lead to false conclusions. Then there are many types of models for a range of circumstances, and using the wrong one can yield inaccurate results. The focus here is on the quality of data being used for modeling. If the data are obtained in a biased manner and ultimately show no pattern, then neither will the results of the modeling. Plus, accurate models require evaluation as to the quality of data used, and we're doing that right now. Also, accurate models also require comparing their conclusions with real data, which Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks does not have, which makes data collection even more crucial and requires a scientific approach. And moving on, when it comes to the mule deer population, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks makes the exact same statements as they did with the white-tailed deer populations. Therefore, this data has also undergone a great deal of guessing rather than scientific evaluation, at least according to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks' most current information on their website. The elk counts are even worse. They state that elk are counted in winter or spring by aircraft, and it's not possible to count all elk in a management unit, and elk plan objectives are based on observed elk, which may be elk observed on trend areas in some cases. Counting elk is an inexact exercise, subject to a multitude of weather and timing variables, and elk movements between hunting districts. Therefore, counts in some years may not accurately reflect elk numbers, and better counts from previous years are reported. In other words, they don't really know how many elk there are either. Therefore, it's not possible to actually show a trend that wolves threaten any of these prey populations. And even if they did, the effect is still dependent on how many wolves there are. So how many are there? Well, in the past, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks tried to literally count the number of wolves on the landscape. And these numbers were collected by 5 wolf management specialists. And they were part of Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And these data were provided in the annual reports. Every year, the wolf management specialists collected data in their region, including an actual count of wolves, at least as close as they could get. And when added together, the 5, quote, actual counts were reported at the end of the year as the minimum number of wolves in Montana. The annual minimum numbers were then used to make management decisions. They were used in mathematical models to determine the hunting quotas, and they were also used as comparisons from one year to the next. For example, a 15% increase in the minimum wolf count was observed from 2010 into 2011. However, remember this 15% increase, because we're going to get back to it. Data collection is crucial here because analysis can only be as good as the quality of data collected. Therefore, a scientific approach is necessary. So I contacted one of the wolf management specialists and asked if they used any protocols when collecting their data in the field. He told me, Jay, there are no protocols. No protocol would be necessary or even help, really. So apparently, scientific protocols were never used to collect the data, despite Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks' claims that wolf management is based in science. Instead, gathering information about wolves involved aircraft, vehicles, tracking, and reliance on public information, especially hunters. And before we proceed, as a note, in 2017, I was invited to talk with the top 2 wolf managers in California. They had just gotten wolves back into the state and were trying to figure out the best way to manage wolves in the future. They had interacted with Montana wolf managers and decided that going about it a different way was best, because in their view, Montana was making too many mistakes. They wanted to talk with a scientist who studied wolves in Montana and get their perspective rather than a management perspective at that point. At least that's what they told me. And accurately counting how many wolves they had was a priority to them. So I showed them exactly what I'm going to show you now regarding how the state of Montana counted their wolves in the past. In the end, they were shaking their heads as to how Montana counted their wolves. So you don't need to be a math whiz to follow what I'm about to show you. Just simple logic will do. When I began looking at Montana's wolf population numbers, I knew they were a mess but needed to figure out why. So I started with the most basic premise of how populations of living organisms can expand in number or decrease in number. It's more complex than that, given all the environmental factors that can affect a population of species. However, to get the general point, the simplest way to demonstrate how populations increase or decrease in size over time is to use an equation that high school biology classes use. So let's see if Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks even used it. In other words, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. And there are 4 components to this equation. One of them is immigration, meaning the number of individuals that join a population. There's emigration, the number of individuals that leave a population. Then, of course, there's births and deaths. And with this basic information, you can get the idea of how a population of organisms changes over time, and that would be called the growth rate equation. In other words, you plug in these basic 4 pieces of info to see if a population grew in size or got smaller and so on over time. And this is pretty much as simple as it can get. In their annual reports, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks provided numbers in these specific categories that you see in the table up until the mid-2000s. And I put this data in a table to help summarize it. However, it's just raw data and it's not very, very meaningful at this point. So let's construct a picture of it and put some logic to this to see how the data is really, if it's really saying something or not. Again, we'll use 2009 as the example because that's when the greatest number of depredations occurred. So let's pull this out and we'll add the equation. So let's see if Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks used this simple equation to figure out how many wolves there really were. We'll try to fill it in with the numbers that they reported in their annual reports. First up is immigration numbers, which are never reported, so that number was always missing. Then there's dispersed animals, which were based on collared wolves, which is how Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks knew that they had left the local population. And during these years, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks reported any pups that their wolf management specialists could document. And in 2009, that was 166. So we added that to the equation now. Then there are the number of deaths, which include almost all the remaining categories. So when you do the simple math, it shows that there are still 2 unknowns, the growth rate and immigration. So let's take a closer look. Immigration is never measured and cannot be calculated using the growth rate equation. Immigration is based on a few collared wolves, therefore it's a guess. And to be practical, half of the equation is missing every year. Plus, the categories of missing and unknown have not yet been considered, because they reported those numbers too. In other words, using the growth rate equation makes no sense because it was not used to begin with. So how was the minimum number of wolves for the year calculated? So we're going to take another approach here, and let's use some logic in all this and see if their process of collecting data on wolves actually made sense. So let's go start again with the example of 2009 and the data that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks reported for that year. So they reported at the end of 2009 that the minimum number of wolves in the state was 524. Using the numbers that Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks reported, you would have to go from 497 wolves at the beginning of the year, which was the previous year's ending number, to 524 at the end of 2009. And we ideally want to do that by using all the numbers that were reported by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks for 2009. So, how do they go from one number to the other? Notice that all the reported numbers were used at the moment because they all have something to do with wolves being removed from the general population. So that brings the number of wolves down to 217. But from there, we have to get to the reported number of 524 by the end of the year. In other words, an input of 307 wolves throughout the year from somewhere needed to happen. And it needed to happen by the end of the year. So there were the births that were reported in their 2009 annual report, which was 166. But that leaves immigration. In other words, other wolves had to come in from somewhere. But that's a number that's never reported, nor was it actually possible to obtain. In other words, no one's standing at the border of Montana monitoring the wolves entering the state. So the immigration number is unverified. It's never mentioned in the annual reports. It's never measured. There is no way to calculate this number using the growth equation. Therefore, it's fabricated. However, it is used to help calculate the number of wolves and is just assumed in the minimum number every year. Which begs the question, how did Fish, Wildlife, and Parks actually get their end-of-the-year minimum totals? For example, let's look at what each year was like when it comes to the number of reported wolves by Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And we're going to pull out and add up the number of unverified wolves that are assumed in the end-of-the-year minimum totals. So let's start with 2003. Given their numbers, apparently 7 wolves came from somewhere. It's unverified, but the only way to get from one number to the next, from the beginning of 2003 to the end of 2003, 7 wolves had to be added from somewhere. But it's unverified, so let's pull that out and start totaling these. In the next year, in 2004, this is the only year in which it was reported that more wolves left the population, meaning immigration, than came into the population. However, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks reported 2 wolves had dispersed. However, apparently 24 wolves left the population, not only 2. This means the reported number is wrong because had they known about the other 24 wolves, then Fish, Wildlife, and Parks would have reported it in the dispersed category. Therefore, not only are they wrong, but no one did the math to check. Nevertheless, these 24 wolves are unverified. So let's pull them out and add them to the total here. Now we're going to go through each year. Hopefully you can see at this point that when using Fish, Wildlife, and Parks reported numbers, that there is no way to go from the total at the beginning of the year and arrive at the end of the year total. The end of the year numbers always contain a number of wolves that cannot be verified. So let's keep going. And we're going to continually pull out the unverified wolves here each year. And you can see every year this is happening. And by 2011, there was a whopping 152 wolves added to the end of the year minimum total that could not be verified. But by 2012, the number of births were no longer in the annual reports. They weren't being reported. And therefore, the immigration number could no longer be calculated. So this was the end point of my published review. So, over this 9-year period, there was a total of 762 extra wolves that were reported, when you're using Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks numbers, with no idea where they came from. So this is an average 21.4% error in minimum population every year. And remember that 15% increase in minimum wolf population from 2010 to 2011? How then can you know if there was an increase or not if the error in your database is greater than the increase? So the 762 unaccounted for wolves over these 9 years were fabricated because there were no verifiable data to prove their existence. In other words, the 762 wolves means nothing scientifically. Therefore, the end of the year minimum population numbers are claims rather than actual numbers because they cannot be verified. So over a 9-year period, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks made up, or to give them the benefit of the doubt, overestimated the wolf population by an additional 762 wolves, according to their numbers. Plus, there was no way to get to the end of the year minimum totals without having to add wolves to the population somehow each year. So somewhere in their methodology of counting wolves, there was some step that was missed, or not done correctly, or something that caused these additional and non-existent wolves to show up in their data. This is important because the minimum numbers they got at the end of each year were used to make management decisions and set the hunting quotas. So if your brain caught on fire, that's because none of this makes sense. And the numbers they do have are unverified. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks uses wolf population numbers provided by people who want to kill these animals, meaning the hunters and so on. Therefore, the numbers they collect are based on anecdotal information and not science. And Fish, Wildlife, and Parks never use scientific methodology to collect their data to begin with, and they certainly don't by using the observations of hunters. And for a full review of this paper, you can just go to my website at wolfandwildlifestudies.com. If you want to download a PDF copy or just read it online. So the question now becomes, does their current method do the same thing? In their most current wolf management plan, which is 2023, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks states some of the reasons why they eventually went from physically counting wolves and getting an annual minimum count to the method they use now, which is the Integrated Patch Occupancy Model, or IPOM. And apparently the wolf population grew too large for a limited staff to monitor. They also stated that this past approach, meaning the wolf management specialists just counting wolves, consistently underestimated the total number of wolves and was thereby ineffective in providing accurate population estimates. This may be true given that Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks was trying to get an annual minimum number of wolves. However, they inadvertently fabricated an additional 762 wolves over a 9-year period, which were never verified, nor could they have been. These extra wolves were just integrated into each annual minimum wolf count with apparently no idea that this was happening on the part of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And these extra numbers carried over into the following year, every year. If anything, they overestimated the number of wolves instead. They just didn't know it. This is what happens when scientific protocols are not followed, most especially during data collection. Yet these inaccurate minimum totals were used to make management decisions and set hunting quotas each year, based on the thinking that there were more wolves than there actually were. But now, according to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, there are too many wolves to literally count, which they clearly didn't do properly anyway, and now they're using the IPOM method instead, a modeling system that will literally guess the number of wolves. During the years when Fish, Wildlife, and Parks was transitioning from counting wolves to IPOM, they included progress updates in their annual reports. Here's an example from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks' 2014 annual report. They explained that keeping track of the wolf population was no longer cost-effective, given the increased workload, the declining federal funding, and there were simply not enough staff members to get the job done. So IPOM was being developed instead. and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks literally didn't have enough people in the field to gather the full amount of data needed to count wolves. But hunters and some of the public are constantly in the woods. Therefore, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks began to use hunter observations as a cost-effective means of gathering biological data to estimate the area occupied by wolves in Montana. And there are some serious problems with this. Impressions about wolf abundance from hunters is not science because Fish, Wildlife, and Parks did not control for bias during the data collection. And they needed to because now they were and currently are collecting, quote, objective data is required by scientific protocol from the very people who paid for the right to kill these animals. The hunters' expertise of identifying wolves from coyotes under field conditions, especially at a distance, for example, has never been evaluated. Hunters are not necessarily trained to collect data scientifically. For example, measuring print size, the front versus the back. Do they know the difference? Is it a partial print? And what device did they use to measure the prints? A ruler or just their finger? If scat is found, what's the diameter? The size of scats overlaps among wolves and coyotes. Do hunters know the difference? In addition, no such qualifying questions or observations are made in the online observation form that hunters and others fill out. It's as if Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks makes up their own reality and ignores most scientific topics regarding the environment and the wolves themselves. They mention some of these areas of science in their annual reports, but clearly don't adhere to them. It's more like Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks policies act like a belief system rather than science. When it comes to the IPOM process, it's currently being analyzed by several scientists, led by Robert Crabtree from the Yellowstone Ecological Research Center in Bozeman, Montana. In the abstract of their paper, the authors listed out a number of their conclusions given their analysis of the IPOM process. For example, given the current grid size used in the IPOM method, which divides up the landscape into a grid system on a map to estimate the abundance of wolves, the result, according to the authors, is that the state of Montana has overestimated the wolf population by 2.5 times. I found a similar result in the past when Fish, Wildlife, and Parks was using wolf management specialists to count the wolf population, which resulted in fabricated numbers. And on paper, that increased the number of wolves on the landscape. The authors went on to state that this bias from the way IPOM is used by wolf managers can threaten wolf populations. They also mentioned that misapplication of the IPOM method, along with the underreporting of the variance in the data, contributed to the overall view that there were more wolves out there than there really are. As I pointed out earlier, when counting wolves in the past or using IPOM, both methods were and are greatly dependent on the observation of hunters, the very people who paid for the right to kill wolves. None of the data collection methods were controlled for, so Fish, Wildlife, and Parks database is filled with bias, which shows up in the analysis of IPOM. In other words, the original data doesn't make much sense. Therefore, neither do the modeling results. Remember the modeling information that we went over? Even when wolf management specialists were collecting data on their own, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks still used mathematical models to analyze their so-called data. And of course now, with IPOM, it's almost purely modeling systems that were used to create the projections of what is happening in the woods. With modeling systems, it's even more crucial that the raw data be collected using scientific protocols, because that's all the modeling systems have to work with. In this example, minimum number of wolves, as miscounted by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks in the past, is put into the model, and the projected effects are then used to create management policy, like how many wolves to kill throughout the year. So you would think it would be important to know how many wolves we actually have, but we don't know. And apparently Fish, Wildlife, and Parks currently thinks that there are 2.5 times the number of wolves that actually exist, which is why the authors stated that the IPOM method threatens wolf populations. Wolf managers are killing too many wolves, given the IPOM results. Nevertheless, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks claims they use science. Certainly not when collecting data, but they do use scientific analysis to crunch their data. But Crabtree's results disputes that as well. The point, however, is that if the original data is blatantly inaccurate because it wasn't controlled for when the data was initially collected, then it doesn't matter how great the analysis is. Perhaps their mathematical model works great, but if it's based on garbage data, then the answers produced are garbage too. Modeling systems can correct only for so much. So the result is crap in, crap out. In Montana, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks data has always been inaccurate and misleading because the numbers were never collected using scientific protocol. And now we can apparently add that their analysis is bad too, meaning the IPOM method or the IPOM model itself was not used properly. IPOM apparently can be accurate if used correctly, which is what Crabtree is saying. But if the original data is not good, then the answers the modeling system produces will be inaccurate, which is what I'm saying. In Crabtree's case, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is fighting back publicly, meaning the local papers, claiming that Crabtree's analysis is not correct and that their use of IPOM is accurate and used properly. In the midst of all this, the two other authors of his paper removed their names from the paper before it was published, although they stand by their analysis, whatever that means, according to the news article that was reported on this issue. And here's the long link that you can use to read this article online if you decide to do so, and then you can see for yourself. However, Crabtree's research results match the pattern of inaccurate data that has always plagued Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, a pattern found by others who have reviewed their data. That includes myself and other scientists like Scott Creel and Jay Rotella. They published a peer-reviewed paper regarding Fish, Wildlife, and Parks' proposed wolf hunt at the time, and found that it could greatly reduce the wolf population because of unintended effects. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks didn't like those results and threatened to cut ties with the Montana State University where Creel worked. As with Crabtree, this situation became another contentious public spat and ended up in the newspaper. As for my review of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks data, I was visited by one of their wolf management specialists who tried to coerce me out of my data on the fish trap pack I was studying at the time so that information could be entered into their database instead. I refused and was told that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks could shut down my project, which of course they couldn't. Apparently, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks doesn't like it when scientists do their job, use logic and reasoning to point out the flaws in their system. And this is not a new phenomenon either. Trying to get a grasp on how wildlife managers obtain the data needed to make management decisions is an issue in other places as well. In Canada, for example, they have had the same problem when it comes to the claims of wildlife managers, which is that science is used in their management decisions. For example, as reported in the journal Science, which is the #1 scientific journal on Earth, the authors described the same process that goes on in Montana in regards to wolves, but in this case, it involved grizzly bears. Despite mortality rates caused by humans that exceeded a future sustainable population of grizzlies in British Columbia, the government kept hunting them. And the authors pointed out that governments can make science-based claims without being held to the same standard of transparency and scrutiny expected from scientific researchers. And therein lies the overall problem to all of this. In future videos, we're going to go over the positive effects wolves have on the environment, which is eliminated, of course, when they're hunted. And we'll go over the effects hunting has on wolf populations and pack dynamics as well. In other words, we're not done yet going over how wolves are managed and what that means to our ecosystems. Hunting them serves no biological purpose, and instead, it's aimed at making money by treating wolves as a crop and harvesting them instead. There is no grand conspiracy here or cover-up. To Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, it's just business. But the suffering and damage to the environment is very real and is proven by science. Therefore, if you don't like what state agencies are doing to your wolves, please contact them as a way to begin combating the insane process of killing these animals. As in the previous video, here is the contact information for sending in your comments to Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, among others, and use the information you're learning in these videos and other sources to make your case. So thank you for watching. Until next time.